And that concludes our opening statements from the witnesses. We'll now turn to questions from the subcommittee members, and the chair will recognize himself for a round of questions. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. McMacken. And you, Mr. McBroom, is there a way in which we can reconcile, the two approaches which you present? That is the free allocation approach, which Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee are proposing, or some border protection measures which are taken as well. Is there a way to do them in concert, sequentially? What would be your recommendation if they could be put together as complementary policies?
Mr. Chairman, our working group doesn't have a formal position on the border equalization provision, so I guess that means we don't have a formal position on the interface of the two. But let me say this, sort of as for myself at least, that I think it's reasonable to say that most people who would support doing both would say that there is a role for border equalization at least as a backup measure and as one of the weapons in the armamentarium of our negotiators. For instance, kind of as a necessity, the allowance grants takes priority because if we eliminate the cost differential at the source, there is no cost differential to be equaled at the border. But what if the allowances are inadequate? What if some future Congress decides to eliminate allowance grants? Well, then some believe that rather than let leakage proceed, which is unacceptable, that at that point consideration of a WTO compliant border equalization process, or at least negotiations that involve those, might be a good policy.
Okay, Mr. McBroom.
Well, I want to begin by associating myself with the remarks of Mr. McMacken. I think we're in complete agreement. Both should be utilized. Both can be utilized. They serve complementary purposes, but somewhat different purposes. Some have noted the issue that the IBWAP approach would not deal with exports. A grant of free allowances would, in fact, accomplish that because you are providing a direct grant of allowances or a subsidy to industries that are impacted by competitiveness, and that helps solve both of those issues at the same time.
So let me get on to you, Ms. Clausen. Do you agree with that? Can they be made complementary as policies?
You could, but I'd like to take issue a little bit with what Mr. McMacken said about having all of these things in your quiver as you go and do an international negotiation. I think actually the border measures would have the opposite effect and make it very difficult to negotiate an international agreement. So I think if you're going to include them, they should absolutely be a last resort.
Okay, let me come back to Mr. McBroom. You heard what Ms. Clausen just said.
No, not entirely. I would make 2 points referencing both her comment and other comments that have been made by committee members. Recently, as Mr. Whitfield acknowledged, Chinese officials came into the United States and they have protested very loudly on 2 points. One is that they don't want a border adjustment mechanism. In that, I would say they protest too much. The fact that they're protesting as vigorously as they are would indicate that it is, in fact, effective leverage. Because at the same time, they're saying that they don't want to be held accountable for any of the emissions from any products that they make that export to the United States. So they want the jobs, they want the factories, they want the economic growth.
Mr. McBroom, let's come back to Ms. Clausen. What's your answer, Ms. Clausen?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it was a Pew Center event at which the Chinese Director General spoke.
Congratulations on having such an interesting event.
and I actually think it was misreported. I mean, they did raise the issue of their goods, but you know that this has been common in international negotiations. I mean, the Canadians raise it all the time. So they weren't actually making it as a proposal. They were just sort of making a point. So unfortunately, I think the AP story was slightly off.
And Mr. Ciccio, Ms. Clausen, suggests that we should wait to cap greenhouse gas emissions until we have a global agreement. What do you think of that approach?
I do not think we can get a global agreement unless we act first.
Mr. Morgenstern, do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. McMacken, do you agree with that?
Mr. Chairman, I think that we will be aided in getting a global agreement if we do an Inslee-Doyle type measure for this simple reason.
No, that's right. So you agree that it would be good if we pass something first before we begin to negotiate?
Our group is solely limited to working constructively on that provision.
That's great. Thank you. Mr. McBroom.
The most likely scenario is that Congress will pass something first, because I think it'll be too difficult in a very short period of time to negotiate an international agreement that will include mandatory binding commitments on the large emitters in the developing world. The negotiation will simply take too long, so as a practical matter, in terms of chronology, you're most likely to see domestic legislation move first.
Great. Thank you, Mr. McBroom. My time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a couple points. First, I want to talk a little bit about coal. And Mr. McBroom, I'm glad that you're here. Though you didn't say this specifically, it was in your testimony. I just want to reiterate it that China's coal use as a percentage of world consumption increased from about 20% in 1985, and it will almost double by the year 2025. We know that China is bringing online almost 2 new plants every single week. In fact, in 2006, China brought into service 90,000 megawatts of new coal-fired generating capacity, which amounts to 2 large coal-generating units every week, as I said. And we also know that emissions have increased by 80% since 1990, and they're projected to rise by another 65% by 2020. Now, it's my understanding that they have made some strides, and I think they're using low sulfur coal, but obviously they're not using carbon, the new technique that we'd like to see happen, carbon capture. And because we haven't developed the carbon capture technique fully yet, in this country, I don't think we brought a single new coal plant online in the United States at all last year. So what's happening is that they are imitating what we've done on coal. They have another, in all likelihood, of about 50 or 60 years probably of generating capacity with the current technology that we have. And obviously, that is one of the big reasons why they have become the #1 emitter in the world. Now, this statement that is in today's Wall Street Journal that's been referenced a couple times by my colleagues dating back to the conference earlier in the week. If other countries, this is from Secretary Chu, who says, quote, if other countries don't impose a cost on carbon, then we will be at a disadvantage. And we would look at considering perhaps duties that would offset that cost, he says. Li Gao, a senior Chinese negotiator from the National Development and Reform Commission, told Dow Jones Newswires Monday that a carbon tax would be a, quote, disaster, would prompt a trade war, and wouldn't be legal under the WTO. And then he says this, in quotes, it does not abide by the rule of the WTO, and secondly, it's not fair, end quote, adding that his delegation would relate China's concerns to U.S. officials. Now, as we look at manufacturing in this country and the charts in terms of the loss of jobs, we see what China is doing without real clean coal technology, and we see what will, I think, will be a real migration of jobs, and will, as much as we'd like to say, well, we can use the WTO to make sure that they have to purchase offsets. We heard last year from Susan Schwab that, in fact, that would provide a real difficulty. And we see what the Chinese are saying. And furthermore, we had testimony last year. In India and China, neither one of them thought that they would really want to participate. So to me, it sounds a little bit like pie in the sky. I don't know how we achieve what we'd all perhaps like to see happen. And we just see a further migration of the jobs. And Mr. McKinnon, as a board member on OI, I don't know how much production is in this country. I know that OI has international facilities all around the world. And you're in the state of Ohio, 86% of your electricity comes from coal. So if you impose these burdens, and I don't know whether you have, I don't know Ohio all that well. I don't know if you have production in Ohio. Do you? OI?
We have some production in Ohio, yes.
How much of that is, how much of a base in Ohio do you have in terms of total production that you've got? 20%, 50%?
No, we are about a third of our worldwide production is in the United States. Our major states of production are Pennsylvania and California.
And what will happen if we have something like this that will have a cap and trade and increase those costs, knowing in fact that, you know, as we look at China, I think they're about, currently, if we send all those jobs there, they don't export all that much here, but it'll be a higher burden for us.
Mr. Upton, I'm from the little town of Brockway, Pennsylvania, which has 2 of these glass plants. And my main motivation is to give those people a fair level playing field to compete against foreign location suppliers. So I do agree, unless we do something that mitigates the cost that would be imposed on energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries like glass, that employment will suffer and jobs around the country, including in Brockway, Pennsylvania, will be at risk.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I would just say to my colleagues, I think we all accept the fact that if we implement a cap-and-trade system and don't put in some provisions in the bill to deal with issues of leakage or issue with coal-fired utility plants, of course, it's going to end up being a very expensive proposition, and jobs are going to be lost, and it's not going to be a good way to go. And we're going to pass a bill because I don't think many members will vote for a bill like that. What we're trying to do, and what we're trying to learn more about today, is how we can put provisions in the bill that deal with some of these issues, so we don't have some of the things that we're afraid may happen if we do nothing. So it's the whole part of this hearing, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on this bill. Mr. McBroom, thank you for your testimony today. I was glad to hear you say and to see that there's a widespread agreement on the panel that the border tax and the proposal that Jay and I have been working on are, you know, don't compete with one another or are not mutually exclusive of one another. Both can be done, and one doesn't negate, you know, the effects of the other. And I agree. I think we need as many weapons in the arsenal, so to speak, as we can. So I was happy to hear your testimony today. Mrs. Clausen, Mr. McMacken shared a report with us that's offering some suggestions as the best way to answer the eligibility question. You know, what industry should or shouldn't be covered by this policy. What do you think about the energy-intensive trade exposures benchmarks that his report suggests? Have you had a chance to see it?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to look at it. We will look at it, and I'd be happy to get back to you on what we think of it.
Thank you. And Mr. McMacken, you know, we appreciate you saying that our proposal is a breakthrough, but we know we still have some more work to do, and probably this whole issue of eligibility of you know, looking at these industries and these industry subsects, there's still a lot more work to be done, and we need some more data. But I look forward to seeing the report that you have on the subject. I haven't had a chance to read it yet either, but we're looking forward to do that. I wonder if, for the benefit of our colleagues here on the committee, if you could just take a moment and express to our colleagues here the process as you view it that helped lead us to this latest version of the proposal.
Mr. Doyle, I've been doing policy work in Washington for about 30 years, and the process on crafting to this point the energy-intensive foreign trade exposed relief provision has been as constructive as I have been engaged in. It's been transparent, it's been open and inclusive. We had the advantage, of course, that the leakage problem is every bit as much an environmental problem as it is an economic problem. Sure. So all stakeholders had a real incentive to solve it, and we have made very good progress because everyone has been able to engage in a constructive dialogue.
Thank you. And Mr. Morgenstern, I think your testimony also made a strong case for why you know, certain industries face unique challenges of leakage and loss of competitiveness. And you talked a little bit about the free allocation, free allowance allocation as part of the solution to the problem. I just want to give you an opportunity, too, if you wish to expand on what you see as the strengths or weaknesses of our approach and how it could be improved.
Well, I think the idea that you have identified energy intensity and trade sensitivity as the key issues is absolutely right, and I commend that completely. I think in any of these approaches there are details that need to get sorted through, and there are major data issues, as you and others have referred to, that kind of limit the ability to have a very precise answer as we sit here. And presumably some additional information will be forthcoming in, for example, the EPA registry, which is forthcoming. I think the idea that Congress would ultimately give very precise guidance to the agencies is really important, and not leave this open to a great deal of discretion, because I think that can simply that can cause problems down the road.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'll yield back my time.
All right, gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to acknowledge in the audience a former colleague and chairman of the Science Committee, Congressman Sherrod Boehlert of New York, a nemesis of this committee when he was on the Science Committee, but a good friend and an avid baseball player, so baseball fan. Mr. Chairman, I have two articles from today's papers I'd like to put into the record. The Washington Times article that headlines Obama Climate Plan could cost $2 trillion, and the Washington Post article, trade barriers could threaten global economy.
It sounds like two things we want in the record. So without objection, we'll include them.
Well, it's two things that need to be in the record, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you and the members of the committee allowing them to be in the record. Mr. McMacken, you talked about an efficiency standard in your testimony. Would you and your group support such a standard absent a mandatory cap-and-trade program?
Mr. Barton, I think that most of the members of the group would be very reluctant to. Efficiency standards are more in the nature of the command and control type regulation than the more market-oriented cap and trade. And we think that Mr. Inslee and Doyle have found a way to make it work within the context of an allowance grant of cap and trade, but that's a very different consideration of in its absence.
Okay. Mr. Ciccio, you point out in your testimony that industrial emissions in the United States have only gone up about 2.5 or 2.6%, while residential, commercial, and transportation emissions have gone up between 27 and 29%. In your opinion, is it possible to cap and trade those parts of the economy that continue to go up more rapidly than the economy itself?
The question is, can we cap the other sectors?
Yes, sir.
Just those sectors?
Yes, sir. I mean, it seems sort of silly to cap industrial emissions when they're going up less than the rate of growth of the economy, but commercial, residential, and transportation are going up 10 times as rapidly. If you really want to cap it, that's where you have to do it, but I don't think you can do it.
No, the capping all of those sectors wouldn't make sense in our view. That there are many, many very cost-effective ways to improve the efficiency and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of those sectors without cap and trade. And the thing that we have to, as a country, continue to look towards in this important debate is cost effectiveness. And an economy-wide cap-and-trade approach is not necessarily, well, in our view, not cost-effective. There are better ways.
Okay. Ms. Clausen, first let me say I enjoyed our dialogue at the Congressional Quarterly Breakfast. You're actually a very pleasant person. When you're not testifying, disagreeing with me on whatever the subject happens to be. My question for you, because we talked about it at the CQ breakfast, would the groups that you represent support meeting our electrical generation targets with natural gas plants, even though natural gas, when you consume it or burn it, it does create CO2. It just creates less CO2 than coal plants.
Well, I enjoyed our breakfast too, and you're a very nice person when you're not asking me hard questions. So,
that's my easy question.
First of all, I should clarify that I don't represent anybody other than the Pew Center. We work with lots of companies ourselves. We work within U.S. CAP, so we work with lots of companies.
Do they accept natural gas as an element of our electric
I think
generations?
most would agree that natural gas could be a transition because, of course, it does result, I mean, burning natural gas does result in greenhouse gas emissions, but far less than coal. On the other hand, we are very sensitive to what we could call a dash for gas because
So
we really think coal is going to be part of our
We put you
future.
down as undecided on that? You could go either on the other. Well, anytime somebody answers a question on the other
hand,
then it's.
Look,
I've got one more question. I
just want to say there's no single solution here. You need all of it. We have to do carbon capture and sequestration. In my opinion, we have to do nuclear. We have to use gas. We have to do efficiency. I mean, we just need everything.
I'll take that as a yes. Dr. Thorning, can I ask one?
Please, yeah, please.
I tried to get it in before it went to zero, Mr. Chairman. I was starting to ask the question. So.
You were wasting a lot of time being gracious to each other, okay? And just stick to the subject.
I've learned that from you, though, Mr. Chairman. It's a good trick. Dr. Thorning, you go into some of the economic consequences of reducing our CO2 emissions below the 1990 baseline and other baselines. The Obama budget would reduce, by the year 2020, emissions 14% below the 2005 baseline and 83% by the year 2050. I'm told if we adopt the Obama budget and actually meet those targets, by 2050, we will have an absolute emissions level in this country last seen in 1910 and a per capita emissions level last seen in this country in 1875. 1875. Do you think the American people would support those types of lifestyle changes to get those draconian reductions?
I think the American public would be reluctant to make the drastic changes in lifestyles that would be necessary under any of the major plans. In my testimony, I have a couple of charts, one of which shows the per capita emission reductions that would be required by 2020 and 2030 to comply with the Obama plan. The cutting emissions from an average of 23 tons per person right now down to approximately 18 by 2020 and down to perhaps 12 by 2030 would require the kind of changes that the American public simply would not go along with. So I think we need to be very cautious as we approach this issue because if you can't sell it politically, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the time in the hearing. Let me first say, before I get into my questions, I'm concerned, Ms. Clausen, about the dash for gas also, but that's also because I have a chemical industry that provides a lot of jobs that's really in tough shape right now. But just for the panel, this is probably the last year, is the first year we've actually increased our production of domestically produced natural gas. There's been some great discoveries in the Gulf of Mexico, obviously in the shales in other parts of the United States. So there is a way that we can produce that and literally cut our emissions much down. And I understand the transitional phase, and that's true. But the transition may last a few years until our economy can absorb it. The other issue, I think, that if we do not have something like the Inslee-Doyle Amendment that's enforceable, I don't think we'll see cap and trade. I can't vote for it because I can't see a fake to the blue-collar workers of our country that we're really going to control not exporting your jobs. And again, coming from a blue-collar area that's refinery and chemical jobs, those products could easily be made in India or China. In fact, I had this discussion with a diplomat from India, and I said, you can't expect me to want to send my jobs to you while we're concerned about climate change. Whether it goes up in India or China or in Texas, it still creates carbon in our atmosphere. And so that's why that amendment, and as strong as possible, I think our country can provide leadership in climate change and still say this is the way we want to do it. And we haven't had that leadership for a number of years. And I would like to see the leadership, but I also want to make sure it goes in the right direction. Mr. Mackin, in your testimony, you state that a true cost-negating anti-leakage provision would address all indirect or other direct costs, and that the Inslee-Doyle approach would not compensate for cost increases on feedstocks or other inputs. Nor would it compensate for the demand and the demand curve caused increases in natural gas. I believe in all the higher costs contribute to the cost of competitiveness. Shouldn't a compensation program take these and other indirect cost impacts into account?
Congressman, it is true that the Inslee-Doyle provision would leave a significant gap in making up for these regulation-caused cost increases, and that does raise the risk of leakage, and that's one of the reasons that we're looking forward to continue to working with Congressman Doyle and Inslee and others on the provision to try and make sure we get that balance right.
So what percentage do you have an idea what we would need to cover those full indirect costs?
It's very difficult to know, because the one you mentioned that is the most troublesome, the most difficult to measure, is that part of the increase in natural gas, which is not just a function of the allowances that need to be submitted for its combustion, but that part of the increase that increases because demand for it will go up and the demand curve will shift precisely because it is carbon advantage. It would be very difficult to know how to measure that.
Okay. Anyone else like to touch on that one before I go to another? Yes.
Yes, sir, I would. Increased natural gas demand and the resulting increase in the price of natural gas is only part of the increased cost. The fact is that across the country, natural gas-powered generation sets the marginal price for electricity. So as the price of natural gas goes up because of climate policy, that will help drive up the price of natural gas also. So actually, there's two impacts that are not accounted for in the Inslee-Doyle approach.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Morgenstern, in your testimony, you state that the hardest hit industry is by a carbon price signaler, chemicals, plastics, primary metals, non-metallic minerals, and that over the long term, you estimate that the leakage rate for the few most vulnerable industries could be as high as 40% in the case of the unilateral $10 per ton of CO2 price. At $10, you estimate a 40% leakage rate. The Obama administration estimates that carbon permits will sell for $20 on the average under their cap-and-trade proposal. How much would you estimate of leakage change under $20 per ton for the average carbon cost?
Congressman, we have actually not done that calculation. It might be somewhat higher, but it's certainly not double. I'm pretty sure of that. We're in the process of doing that analysis right now.
Okay. Appreciate any follow-up that you can provide to the committee. In your testimony, you state that under a unilateral policy that established a price on carbon dioxide emissions, a readily identifiable set of industries is at a greater risk of contraction over both the short and long term, and the hardest hit industry, petroleum refining, will likely be able to pass along most cost increases, thereby muting the impacts. On what statistics do you base your assertion that the refiners can pass through all their costs?
Well, Congressman, the principal statistic is the percentage of product which is imported. And as opposed to certain other industries which have a much higher percentage of their product imported, petroleum refining has a relatively small number. I don't have the actual number at my fingertips.
Okay. I would estimate that, I think I've heard numbers that 60% of our oil is imported. So does that seem right?
Well, Congressman, I think you have to distinguish between imported crude oil and finished product. And imported crude oil would be subject to the same charge as domestically produced crude oil. So there's not going to be any change in incentives on that side. It's strictly on the slightly additional cost of refining, because refining, as you well know, is an energy-intensive activity. Yeah. So that activity would be there would be some additional costs associated with that, and they would not be completely able to pass them along. But given the relatively small percentage of product that's imported, they would be relatively protected.
As studied by the Near Economic Consulting on the impacts of Lieberman Warner on the refining sector states that the level of cost pass-through is highly uncertain, particularly in later years, since price increases depend upon the nature of increased costs, the level and nature of international competition, and other factors. One of these factors is the market and the fact gasoline stations compete and consumers make choices based on a penny of difference per gallon. Given these realities and uncertainties, how can we be certain American refiners will be able to pass through all their costs? Won't competition from international products undermine the cost recovery to a certain extent? For example, higher carbon costs in U.S. relative to international sources of refined products could likely lower the pass-through of carbon cost.
Congressman, you are correct that they will not be able to pass through 100% of their costs. There will be some burden placed on domestic refineries. Compared to the other industries we studied, we believe it will be relatively small.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ryan, hold up the chart. What happens to these coal miner jobs in a cap-and-trade regime, Ms. Clausen?
If we can get carbon capture and sequestration up and running.
How long is that going to take us? What's the projections?
Well, there are lots of projections.
What's the shortest time projected?
Probably 10 years.
10 years. 10 years. What happens to these jobs if we don't have carbon capture and sequestration immediately? You know, the difference between the Clean Air Act amendments in '90 and now is that we could fuel switch or we had technology. Is there current technology to save these coal miner jobs?
I mean, I believe that the first thing that happens when you put a cap and trade in place is that people try to become more efficient, because that is the cheapest way.
But we have legislation called New Source Review that doesn't allow coal power plants to be efficient. In fact, it delays the implementation of more efficient generators with a permitting process that takes years.
Please don't ask me to talk about New Source Review.
Yeah. It's a failure of our policy, and of course, let me go. Anyone else want to answer the question, what happened to these jobs? Mr. Morgenstein?
Congressman, I guess I would note that in several of the analyses that have been done, I believe by the Energy and Information Administration, they find, and it does depend on scenario, you are correct, but they find that actual production, domestic production in 2020 is higher than it is today.
Do you know what happened to the state of Ohio when they passed the Clean Air Amendments in 1990? We had testimony of that last week. You know how many jobs they lost? 35,000. Dr. Thorning?
I'd like to mention that in Table 1 of my testimony, I do present various scenarios from EPA and EIA, including scenarios that we think are more realistic. Under EPA's scenario number 7, when they analyzed Lieberman Warner last year, they assumed slow growth of nuclear generating capacity. They assumed carbon capture and storage would not be available till at least the 2020 or 2025. And they found that there would be a significant...
I'm really running out of time. I got 3 more major issues.
So I think...
do we lose coal mining jobs?
Pardon?
Do we lose?
Significant number of coal mining jobs, and those are detailed in the ACCF
Mr. Ciccio?
study.
Sir?
Yes. An absolute correlation to your point I can relate to manufacturing, and that is that when energy prices went up in this country relative to the rest of the world, we lost 2 million manufacturing jobs in a period of less than 2 years.
Isn't that the intent of climate change legislation, to raise energy rates?
Yes.
It's President Obama's statement. Let me quote from the Washington Post, April 9th. Higher electricity rates are the intent of the whole exercise. If there were no effects, why should you have a cap-and-trade system? Now, when you address the manufacturing jobs, basically your testimony talks about the emission side. what is the job loss because of higher energy costs?
As I said, there is a direct correlation to the increased costs of natural gas and then electricity that started in 2000 to 2003. We lost 2 million manufacturing jobs just like that.
I'm not trying to be disrespectful, or I just don't have a lot of time. So higher energy costs relates to job loss. Does everyone agree with that? Yes, everybody's nodding yes. That's the intent of this administration and this legislation. Let me do another quote from President Obama. When President-elect at the time, he was a candidate. When I was asked earlier about the issue of coal, you know, under my plan of a cap-and-trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. So we can talk about the carbon dioxide issue. We're talking about leakage of jobs. I'd love to engage in a debate. Let me ask you this question. From his inaugural address, we will harness the sun and winds and soil to fuel our cars and run our factories. Yes or no? Can we run a factory on wind and solar power?
I'm afraid not. Manufacturing.
Are we close to it?
Well, manufacturing needs reliable energy, and they run often 24/7 solar.
What is the percentage of electricity generated in this country today by renewables? Anyone know?
About 3% if you don't count hydro.
If you don't count hydro, 3%. So if we doubled to 6, that would be a dramatic gain. We will have massive job loss, massive job dislocation, and I challenge the Democrats to move this bill, because we will defeat them at the polls. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Well, I just want to say I'd always welcome my good friend Mr. Shimkus coming and challenging me in the 1st District in the state of Washington. I'll just bring that on, as they say, but that's another matter. Dr. Thorning, I want to ask, we are comparing in any economic analysis 2 scenarios, one an action scenario based on a cap-and-trade bill, one an inaction scenario where we don't respond to climate change. In your assessment, what assumption did you make about the jobs that will be lost in the inaction scenario where we do not, as a result of the significant changes to the climate in the United States? What assumption did you make?
It's an excellent question, and I'd like to draw you back to the figure in my testimony showing the impact on global concentrations of CO2 at the end of this century if we do adhere to the Lieberman-Warner targets, for example, and the rest of the world does not adopt strict targets.
Could you, let me excuse me just for a minute. I only have 5 minutes. Could you just answer the question? What assumption did you make about the job losses that would be caused by climate change if the U.S. Congress sits on its hands and doesn't do something about climate change? What assumption did you make? How many jobs would be lost by the inaction scenario? Just give me a number or a percentage, please.
We did not specifically look at jobs lost due to inaction because climate change is a global problem. It really doesn't matter what the U.S. does because our emissions are an ever-shrinking share. The point is, how many jobs will be lost if we move down a cap-and-trade or even a tax proposal? Because each 1% of GDP is accompanied by a 0.3% increase.
I appreciate your answer because I think it exposes a titanic flaw in your assessment of this problem. There's 2 choices America can make. It can decide not to act on this and have massive job losses in the agricultural economy, massive job losses in the sectors that depend on water, because our snowpack's not going to be in the Cascade, which is feeding our hydroelectric system, which feeds the Boeing manufacturing plant relatively inexpensive electricity. Massive job losses in a whole host of areas. The Stern report indicates it will be 5 times any job losses associated with action on global warming. And your assessment, you're coming in here and telling us we're going to have job loss, when any assessment says we're going to have more job loss that's been done, the only assessment that I've seen, in the course of the globe not responding to climate change. Now, I find that stunning that an economist would come in here and not compare apples to apples in this regard. Now, do I take it that the reason you didn't do that is you thought that because this is a global problem, it just doesn't matter in the U.S. to just ignore it? That's pretty much your assessment, right?
The point of my testimony is that it is a global problem, and even if the U.S. were to hit the targets in the Lieberman-Warner proposal, the administration's own analysis shows it won't matter.
Well, let me just say
we need to think about maintaining economic growth so that we can develop the technology to capture and store.
I have hardly ever heard a more defeatist statement in this hearing that we're just going to let the world go burn, and because we can't solve it alone, we should not do anything. That, I would assert, is not the American act of leadership. There was something that a couple other the witnesses talked about that I'm not sure I fully understood that may be a virtue of the one of the approaches that Mike and I have suggested. And I don't mean to get into a contest between border adjustment or what Mike and I have proposed, because they may be complementary. But I do want to make sure I understand something a couple of witnesses talked about. The approach that Mike and I have suggested would give a benefit on the export side of the economy. In other words, it would give a benefit to our manufacturers as they export product, because they would get this benefit of a free allowance. Do I understand correctly that a trade adjustment, at least to the extent that I've seen them proposed, would not give that benefit on the export side? It would give them a benefit by protecting against imports, competitive imports, but would not give a benefit to our exports, which also have to compete internationally outside of our domestic markets. Is that a correct assessment?
Mr. Inslee, it is. We view that as one of the critical advantages of the Inslee-Doyle type allowance grant. The problem is a WTO prohibition on export rebates. There is some talk of trying to design one that is WTO compliant, but I'm certainly not an expert on that.
Anyone else disagree with that assessment at all? Thank you. Thank you very much.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sisio, China's top climate negotiator Monday said any fair international agreement on emissions reduction should not require China to reduce emissions caused by goods it exports to other countries. This doesn't sound like China wants to play by our self-imposed rules. What evidence do we have that we can convince China to go along if we make our industries less competitive?
Congressman, that's exactly why we have, our testimony has taken the approach that it has, is that cap and trade is not a viable policy option for the industrial sector in developing countries, nor is it good for us. A better approach that all industrial companies around the world understand is productivity. They can control the efficiency. They can control improve the electricity improvement in their plant, the natural gas improvement, or whatever fuel. But they can improve the yield, but it's very, very difficult for them to reduce absolute quantities. There is no movement on the part of the Chinese that we've seen that they will accept a cap and an absolute reduction for the industrial sector. This is why we need to jumpstart negotiations across all developed and developing countries to deal with explicitly the industrial sector from a trade and from a productivity standpoint.
Dr. Thorning, a lot of the policy discussion about effectiveness of cap and trade is derived from large integrated models of the economy and international markets. It involves model-based analysis of what we might expect if the United States and all nations work together to reduce emissions. Do these modeling exercises represent what happens in the real world?
That's an excellent point, Congressman, and I think we need to take account of the reality of politics. For example, stepping back and looking at China, China buys a huge portion of U.S. debt. They're funding our lack of saving. If we impose a border tax adjustment on Chinese and other imported goods, there might be some reluctance on the part of the Chinese to continue to invest in the U.S. So I think we need to look at climate policy as a whole and look how moving one part of our economy through, say, border tax adjustments might impact other parts of our economy. I think the models that have been developed simply do not recognize political reality. We don't have the ability to enforce international agreements. We've been working on this for some 20 years, trying to evolve that type of agreement. It hasn't come about, and according to a recent study by Lee Lane and David Montgomery, it's unlikely to. We're going to have to depend on technology. We're going to have to depend on new technology, new nuclear, carbon capture and storage if we want to continue to grow our economy as well as reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think the models that have been developed simply are not reflective of reality.
Dr. Thorning, what, in a nutshell, is the European industry doing to cope with its cap and trade system, and how does this compare with what the U.S. will face?
Well, the experiment in the European Union, they've had an ETS since 2005, shows that they don't have the political will to tighten down emissions to actually hit their Kyoto target. Without strong new measures, the EU is unlikely to meet their Kyoto target because they've exempted large sectors of their economy and haven't covered enough facilities. Their new plan, their 2020 by 20 reduction, is unlikely to be enforced because it would require significantly higher taxes. The only way Europe will meet their new targets is through economic collapse.
Ms. Clausen, should we be concerned about a trade war if we impose tariffs on countries that don't take action on greenhouse gas emissions? Would a trade war have implications for our relationship with China and other arenas, such as working to improve China's record on human rights or China's relationship with Tibet?
We do not like trade wars. We do not like border adjustment measures. So I think if you're going to use them, they should absolutely be a last resort, and we should do everything else before we get there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, gentleman's time has expired, and we will end the hearing by recognizing Mr. Scalise from Louisiana for a round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to run through them quickly since the vote is going on right now on the floor. Mr. Morgenstern, in your testimony you had stated, and I'll quote this, within the manufacturing sector, the hardest hit industries are chemicals and plastics, primary metals, and non-metallic minerals. Another hard-hit industry, petroleum refining, will likely be able to pass along most cost increases, thereby muting the impacts. When you talk about muting those impacts, clearly if they're passing them on, who are they then passing them on to, and who would actually get that impact if they didn't get the impact?
Congressman, they would pass along the impacts in the form of higher prices, which in turn will enter into consumers' and businesses' calculations about their choice of technologies, new vehicles, et cetera.
Any estimates on how much that would be, how much would be passed on to consumers, let's say when somebody goes to fill up their gas tank, how much more they will pay, or when they go to the grocery store, how much more will they pay?
Yeah, I don't have a number at my fingertips, but it would be a very high proportion of the actual cost of the allowances would be passed forward to the consumers.
And I've seen reports that show up to $3,000 per American family in increased costs due to these pass-throughs, whether it be from electricity bills going up because the utility companies would be able to pass those costs on, or the energy-related products that would also be able to be passed on. And in fact, Mr. Orsag, the President's budget director, himself acknowledged that that there would be increased costs to consumers because of these. So, I guess
Congressman, my colleague Dallas Bertraw, who is not here today, has actually done an extensive study on this question, and there clearly will be higher costs to consumers and to households across the country, and it will vary somewhat by region. And part of the some of the provisions in the legislation presumably would attempt to compensate for those losses.
Yeah, and obviously that concerns a lot of people. Ms. Clausen, if you could real briefly hit on that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a wide range. It depends on the model you use. Some of them are as low as as $200 per household per year. Some of them are as high, as you pointed out, as $3,000 per household per year. I think the most important thing to do is to make sure that there are no price spikes or really high prices for consumers, which you can do by making sure that there are allowances for local distribution companies who provide electricity.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that there are some proposals to exempt certain people, which, of course, under the president's budget, he expects to generate $640 billion in new taxes from this proposal. So that would actually put an even higher disproportionate share. We use the teacher married to the police officer. That married couple would then almost see a doubling if you exempt lower income earners, because that couple would earn about $80,000, and so that teacher married to the police officer would not appreciate the fact that they're considered rich under these proposals and would have to pay maybe $5,000 more. But I've only got about a minute left, and I apologize for that, Mr. Ciccio. You had talked about U.S. industries working on efficiencies for decades. We've seen people cutting back, businesses cutting back. Are there more effective policies that can help foster innovation to provide that next generation of energy efficiency other than this tax policy? Taxing
manufacturing is very energy efficient, but there's always this constant effort. We need good tax policy, faster depreciation. We certainly need the removal of regulatory barriers and financial barriers to utilizing, for example, combined heat and power and waste heat. These are all very positive incentives that would be very helpful to the sector.
And final question, how's regulatory policy such as decoupling electricity rates actually affected your industries?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because decoupling separates volume from price. And manufacturing needs a return on investment to invest in energy efficiency with the objective, of course, of reducing the amount of, for example, electricity that it would consume. But when you decouple, okay, there is all of a sudden a lack of incentive, financial incentive to invest, because the prices will not go down.
And that's all I have. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the all time for this hearing has expired. We thank this panel very much. Obviously, in any legislation which we draft, we are going to need to deal with those industries that are most affected, especially from a trade perspective, from a climate policy which we adopt, and we intend on doing that. We thank this panel very much, and we would like to stay in close contact with you as we're moving along the legislative process. This hearing is adjourned.